So why don't we all settle in and we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like we have a pretty good crowd here. So today we are very pleased to have Dr. Chris Miller provide our grand rounds. Dr. Miller is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And he also completed his residency here in 2012, later completed adult psychoanalysis training at the Washington Baltimore Center for Psychoanalysis, and he currently serves as the director of psychotherapy education in the residency. He's published and lectured on educational frameworks for teaching psychotherapy, on the intersection between neurosciences and psychotherapy, and on the psychodynamic dimensions of film and literature. He's also the author of 2 books, The Object Relations Lens, a psychodynamic framework for the beginning therapist, and Absolute Psychiatry, an essential question and answer study guide for trainees and practitioners. I am sure they're all available on Amazon, and Dr. Miller would be quite happy if you want to pick up a copy. So today we are very pleased that Dr. Miller really is good at kind of picking up a topic and an interesting topic and delving into it and then helping us learn. And today I think we have a really great topic in the phenomenology of near-death experiences. So I welcome Dr. Miller.
Hello. You can hear me okay, I'm assuming, yeah? I got 2 microphones going, so. All right. So we're going to start with some words from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. If a man could pass through paradise in a dream and have a flower presented to him as a pledge that his soul had really been there, and if he found that flower in his hand when he awoke, aye, what then? One of the questions posed by this talk is what we do with truths our minds show us about the nature of reality. We often limit awareness to that which is known, what keeps things predictable, but what space do we allow for those bits of knowledge our minds can generate, but which we have trouble controlling? We used to revere the unknown, things that transcended ordinary understanding. Dramatic pause, because this is not advancing. Let's try it here. Boom. Okay, I think it's because I moved that screen. Okay, so we've moved away from inviting wisdom from less controlled realms of the psyche. We're no longer in the times of soothsayers. Leaders don't consult the oracles before making decisions, maybe the AI version of Oracle. We favor a different form of understanding, one that's based on a belief in absolute knowledge. And since antiquity, people have gathered around sources of light and heat, like fires. They would discuss things that they couldn't control. What's the nature of thunder and such? Our circles and sources of light they've been redefined, to say the least. These are now our oracles. And instead of evoking feelings of awe, our light sources evoke feelings of control. And our desire for control has expanded beyond what Google Maps shows us on Earth. Humans now want to conquer the cosmos. What we're looking for is a bit unclear, but given the endless nature of this quest, maybe we're looking in the wrong places, and maybe we should be looking within for answers. As Stanislav Lem said in Solaris, we have no need of other worlds. We need mirrors. But have we really lost touch with these other dimensions of self? This looks busier than it is, believe me. There is awareness and acknowledgement of other realms of understanding. This was a study done with the Brazilian population, roughly 1,000 people, and it was assessing the prevalence of spiritual and religious experiences in Brazil. So what we want to look at here, let's take a look at these white bars, the never bars. And you can see on the bottom there that we have a whole host of, forms of connecting with something transcendent, connection with nature, ego dissolution, union with God, hearing the dead, seeing the dead, precognitive dreams and such. And you can see that the bar is never, the white bar is never. So it's usually less than half of people that don't report some of these at some point. So there is something within most people going on at some point, and the others may not have thought about it too much. About 30 to 60% of people claim to have experienced a precognitive dream at least once in their lifetime, a prophetic dream. I have a journal of them. I did not dream about how this talk is going to go, so I'm looking forward to being surprised. But our unconscious does have the ability to reshape our beliefs, whether its messages are invited or not. So this was one study done by Morwedge and Norton, and they created a composite score, and they showed a dream of a plane crash would affect somebody's anxiety and travel plans more than a conscious thought of a crash, a warning from the government of a high terrorist attack risk, or learning that a crash occurred along the same route. So dreams have a lot of power in our lives. And coming back to this graph here, the topic of today is near-death experience. And we can see that roughly 30% of people claim to have had one. So if a dream has power to change our beliefs, what can a brush with death do with them? Find out. So, and I'm going to try to, not be a hypocrite and talk about everything being explained through neuroscience. I mean, there is neuroscience. But it's going to be more of a balanced dialogue between some advances we have in near-death state from a biological perspective and also acknowledging we're far from being able to properly map out and make perfect scientific sense of the richness of near-death experiences. There are a lot of footnote wars in the folks who write about this. So these accounts of coming close to death or feeling that one has died and come back with descriptions of what the beyond looks like, they've been around for a long time. They may have had a profound effect on shaping religious beliefs, myths, and afterlife beliefs. The Orpheus myth is a very popular version of that. There have been descriptions dating back to Plato in the Republic. There's some indirect nods in the books of Isaiah and Daniel in the Bible, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was composed in about the 8th century, and a number of well-known people. Carl Jung described having a near-death experience after a heart attack in 1944. But the first systematic collection of near-death accounts, near-death experience accounts, was published by someone called Albert Heim in 1892. And he gathered from different groups, but mostly mountain climbers who had fallen in the Alps and survived. And he published it in the yearbook of the Swiss Alpine Club, as the subscribers among the group know. And the spirit was really to comfort the families of those who had died, saying, this person fell and it was so peaceful for them. It was beautiful for them. So that's probably what your family member went through. This was translated as Remarks on Fatal Falls in 1972. Albert Heim himself had suffered a fall, and he reported a near-death experience. He was 22. He was climbing in the Alps. He fell 66 feet down a mountain, crashed against the cliffs. He said it was painless, felt time slowing, his thoughts speeding up. He considered everybody who, was going to be affected by this and how they could be comforted, and what it would be like if he were to die. It all went by very quickly in his description. You may recognize this name. John C. Lilly developed the sensory deprivation tank, actually, in the mid-20th century. But he supposedly is the first person to use the term near-death experience in his book, Center of the Cyclone. But the real OG is Raymond Moody. And he published the book Life After Life, which is a very interesting book to read, in 1975. He was a medical student, and he interviewed around 150 ICU survivors, and he outlined what the typical features of near-death experiences were, which we'll get into. So it's been shown, a lot of these features are consistent across different cultures and societies. It's not always the case that expectation drives the experience. A lot of people think, well, if you're very religious, you'll see a certain version of things during these experiences versus not. But being an atheist or being religious doesn't predict that they'll happen, and it doesn't necessarily predict what will happen. And some features even run counter to people's well-established beliefs. So what they see in a near-death experience doesn't always align with what they believe to be true on a conscious level. Bruce Grayson gathered a lot of what Moody described, and he developed his own scale based on his own experiences too. I'm not much of a scale guy, and this is the only one I will be talking about. And this is just to kind of give you an outline of 16 features that he discussed. And he broke them into cognitive, affective, paranormal, and transcendental. So the cognitive features are a speeding up of time, maybe more of a distortion of time in some ways, because they can also be slowed. Speeding up of thoughts, reviewing one's past life, and having the sense of a sudden understanding of everything. The affective features, peace, joy, a sense of harmony with the universe, seeing or feeling a brilliant light. The paranormal features, that your senses are heightened. ESP, seeing the future, and having out-of-body experiences or having some sort of dissociation. And what he called transcendental features, entering an unearthly realm, encountering a mystical being or presence, seeing the dead, or seeing religious figures, and reaching a border or a point of no return, which is often somewhere where the experiencer is told they have to come back to Earth. So each item is scored 0, 1, or 2. So there's 16 items. You can score 32. You can score 0. The cutoff is 7. 7 or plus merits further investigation that the person might have had a near-death experience. So there has been an increased awareness of near-death experiences over the past 50 years or so. And it's felt this is owed in part to technological improvement. More people are revived. The medicalization of death. More terminally ill people are being hospitalized and maybe being kept alive for long periods of time on life support because we're able to do so. So they may be coming in and out. They may be able to recount things, what they see. People sometimes say, please stop doing this. I've seen what's beyond, and I want to go there. So there are two main types of near-death experiences. The classic one, where there actually is a threat to your life due to a medical illness, drowning, hypoxia, and such. And the prevalence tends to be roughly between 10 and 20%, depending on what's causing it. Cardiac arrest survivors, there were 2 reasonably large studies, at least as far as this population is concerned, done by Parnia, AWARE 1 and AWARE 2. After a cardiac arrest, the prevalence is roughly 9 to 21%. Bruce Grayson wrote that in the general population, maybe 1 in 20 people will tell you they've had a near-death experience. And the more I've gained interest in this, more strangely enough, people seem to be volunteering their own experiences to me, picking up on my unconscious interest. So this is just kind of giving a little bit of a breakdown according to cause. And you'll see that the prevalence for a lot of these is between 10 and 20%, between 10 and 20, between 0 and 20. Nothing really reaches 30%. So near drowning and motor vehicle accident. You'll see intense grief is here, there. There's something that's called bereavement detachment experience, which the person who's actually grieving goes through a near-death experience type thing while the other person is dying. There's an interesting article from 2025 on that. And then there's the near-death-like experience where, there's no actual, I would be terrified, but that's probably not going to kill you, I'm guessing, unless you have a heart attack on the way in. So near misses in traffic, going down that slide, psychedelic use, you're not going to die necessarily from that, right? But interestingly, the features can be pretty similar to the classic type when there actually is some sort of organic insult. And we'll get into why that is from a biological standpoint. From a conceptual standpoint, why do these things happen? James McLennan, he coined the term ritual healing theory, and he claimed that dissociative states, odd perceptions are actually very early in our evolution, and they're a way of helping us cope with trauma. That's not all I had to say. So we're distancing ourselves from the intensity of the situation by kind of retreating from it a bit, to better survive it. You hear about people with acute stress disorder and how they may be in this sort of sense of unreality. They need a lot of grounding and such. Their minds are a bit overwhelmed by the whole thing. So this is a way of psychically surviving what's going on. And as a corollary, this doesn't relate necessarily to near-death experiences, but after having a TBI, people who have memory impairment and altered consciousness after the TBI may be protected against developing PTSD. So people who have short periods of post-traumatic amnesia may be at higher risk because they're faced with it much more. The more you're able to gain some separateness from the trauma and the less psychically available it is, the more of kind of a protection you might have against PTSD down the line. That's what I just said. So looking at who develops near-death experiences, there's some controversy about this, but there is a sense that maybe these are individuals who already are a little bit more prone to fantasy and to REM intrusions. So, when they go through these processes, they may turn into internally oriented fantasies as a way of kind of dealing with it. And, when fight and flight aren't possible, what do you do then? So turning to something internally coherent may actually help you feel a little bit more scaffolded during the process. I would never recommend this movie without giving a lot of trigger warnings, but Incident in a Ghostland is an interesting depiction of the use of fantasy to psychically survive a horrifying situation. I thought it was a very creative take by the director. But again, don't watch it. So when people are facing a situation close to death, those who had a near-death experience, the whole subjective part of it, they had less psychological distress afterwards compared to those who did not, who just faced the situation close to death but did not have that subjectivity. And after a near-death experience, you're actually less afraid of dying. There's something, what you've seen, that you've witnessed, that makes you less afraid of going through the process for real. So the experience itself, this is straight from Jens Schlieter's book. And he gave a very nice little breakdown, a little description in terms of a narrative of what people come out and tell you. The affected persons report that they were actually able to hear their doctors or other personnel declaring them to be clinically dead, most often in the emergency room. After the tunnel is passed, the person may, in a somehow new spiritual body, watch scenes within the world, sometimes seeing the doctors from above, that may move on to otherworldly scenes. Being slowly accustomed to this new environment, the dead encounters other characters, usually other dead, before finally meeting the major character. Now, here we get to the climax of the plot. This major character, a being of light, non-verbally asks the protagonist to evaluate the life lived, resulting in the life review projected by the being of light. Sometimes people say they see their whole life flashing before their eyes as though they were watching a movie. And after this plot, the narrative turning point unfolds. The protagonist's feelings of peace and joy substantiate the longing of going into the irreversible beyond. But a conflict emerges. The protagonist reaches a barrier, or he is sent home. Therefore, the resolution or denouement of the story is reached. The protagonist returns into his body. Now enriched by the transformational experience, he is somehow awake and may never return to his former careless life. The end. So, from a neuro standpoint, there's a lot of controversy on this topic. There's a lot of stuff I'm not going to go into because I don't understand it, and because there's a lot of dispute about the truth of it. So I tried to find some dialectical truth that I can convey to you. So after experiencing a cardiac arrest, and the person experiences hypoxia, there's cellular respiration, ATP production that are compromised. There's a dysfunction of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. The brain tries to shut things down a little bit. It goes into standby mode for a bit, and it can stay in a suppressed state for somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes. But once this starts happening, this is an ionic gradient collapse, and you have depolarizations. They call them brain tsunamis that start happening. And how long that goes on for is a bit debatable until you reach a point that's irreversible. So some would argue, 5 minutes, some argue 10 minutes, some argue plus. So, but once this starts happening, you start having this depolarization taking place, a whole cascade of events happens. So depolarization, there's going to be intracellular calcium release over there. Calcium release is going to lead to fusion of synaptic vesicles with the presynaptic membrane. As a result, we're going to have release of neurotransmitters in the cleft, and there's going to be dysfunction of monoamine oxidase. These are mitochondrial enzymes. So we're increasing fusion, release, and we're decreasing breakdown. So there's a surge of neurotransmitters, and this happens with a lot of neurotransmitters that are ATP dependent, which is most of them outside of acetylcholine. So that's the one we won't be talking about. So, but we will have an increase in GABA, serotonin, norepinephrine, glutamate, dopamine, and also in endorphins. We remember Heim mentioning how painless the experience was. That may relate to the endogenous or endorphin release. And this is a little bit of why some think that near-death-like experiences, like going down the shark slide, will give you a similar experience, because acute psychological stress also leads to an increase in norepinephrine, endorphins, glutamate, dopamine, serotonin. Less so GABA. Acute psychological stress seems to do the opposite. So there might be a little bit of a priority in terms of increasing glutamate to kind of maintain some level of awareness. Too much GABA, too much relaxing. If fight, flight are still possible, then that might be the priority. But most of these other ones are similarly going to be increased. Hopefully this is making sense thus far. Yes, okay. So we're going to go into some of the different aspects from that scale I was mentioning to you. So in those minutes after physicians stop CPR, the deceased can likely still hear doctors announcing their time of death before everything fades away. And it's thought that hearing may be active in unresponsive patients up until pretty shortly before they die. There are many, many stories of people who seem to be holding on for those who are still living, people who are intubated, people who are on machines, until the person hears, supposedly, from the living, you can let go. It happened to my father. He was holding on, and then the night my mother told him, we'll be okay, you can let go, he died that evening. So it seems there's something to that. And this serotonin surge that happens in these states may be related to this. There's a lot of excitatory serotonin receptors along the auditory pathway. And we mentioned heightening of senses earlier. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, I'm sure you can all read that term right there, so I don't have to tell you what it means. Translation of the term Bardo Thodol, which actually means liberation through hearing during the intermediate state. And the Tibetan book is meant to be read out loud to somebody who's dying. Aldous Huxley was a big fan of this book. And it helps navigate the bardos, those liminal states between death and rebirth. Supposedly was written by people who died and came back, or at least had some access to that realm, instructing them, go towards the light. Don't be scared of the deities you see, of the creatures you see. They're all parts of you. Keep going. Otherwise, you're going to be reborn into one of several different possible forms, some which sound incredibly unpleasant. But it's predicated on being able to hear. Out-of-body experiences, people will often describe finding themselves in another spiritual body, being released from the physical one. So the temporoparietal junction, and more broadly, the temporoparietal occipital junction, that little area, a little bit expanded, maybe towards the occipital part as well, that's a hot zone in near-death experiences. That area seems to be very active. There's surges of gamma wave activity there. And there's a thought that activity there factors into the out-of-body experiences people have, because this area is involved in creating sensory integration, a unified sense of who one is. Heightened activity can contribute to these feelings of floating and perceiving another entity, yourself, basically from a distance. There were a series of experiments in the mid-20th century by Wilder Penfield, who was a neurosurgeon, stimulating these areas. And he doesn't really describe anything as rich as an out-of-body experience you would see in somebody near death. It's mostly a little bit of a sense of unreality, kind of floating a little bit, but nothing as complex as what we're describing here. So that may be involved, but it's not limited to that. So people leave their body and they often describe feeling confused. They're surprised to look down and see their bodies from a distance. They may not recognize that it's them. Disgust is very commonly mentioned. It's like, I don't want to go back into that thing, kind of thing. They're trying hard to tell the doctors to stop, let me go, kind of thing, but they can't talk, so they're trying to do it telepathically. Doesn't tend to work. And part of the reason they don't want to go back is because it's very peaceful, what they're going through. So we mentioned before that states of hypoxia can lead to endorphin release, they can lead to GABA release, and both of these are very calming. It's the brain's way of trying to decrease its metabolic demands and kind of slow things down because it's in a compromised state. So it's trying to protect itself. But as a result, you will have a subjective experience of peace and calm. Mu opioids are all over the place. In the central nervous system, GABA is all over the place in the central nervous system. And we also have a serotonin surge. I know some people in the audience are big fans of 5-HT1A. This is a serotonin receptor that's involved with passive coping. Among all the serotonin receptors, it is the second most evolutionarily preserved. We're talking 600-700 million years ago. Not entirely, but very close. And 5-HT5 is first, but nobody really, sorry if you're a 5-HT5 fan, but 5-HT1A, that's the main inhibitory one. It's a one, it looks like an I, so it's inhibitory. It's involved with passive coping, with a lot of our drugs, buspirone, it's a 5-HT1A agonist, a lot of atypicals are 5-HT1A agonists, so they can help with anxiety. 5-HT1A is, abundant in limbic areas like the amygdala involved in emotional arousal. And this might inform some of the feelings of peace that people have during the serotonin surge. And this leads to one of the evolutionary hypotheses for near-death experiences, which is thanatosis, which is death feigning that happens in animals. So among the 4 Fs that we have, fight, flight, freeze, flop, some have said that flop is the most evolutionarily adaptive in some ways. It's very hard to drag a human shield, if we're in a dangerous situation. But also in terms of predator-prey dynamics, we can see that, here the rat is, it's noticing something's not right. Here it still has some options, right? But when the cat is right on top of it, it flops, And this might serve a couple of functions. Number one, the cats will, believe it or not, may not know that it hasn't been dead for a while. So it's not a fresh kill. So is this animal diseased, and am I going to be in trouble if I eat it? And the second reason is taking one for the team. I'm going to flop, appear dead. The cat's going to drag me away and eat me, and all my friends, can get away, kind of thing. So it's either very selfish or very altruistic, depending on your belief system. But the point is that this is passive coping. So there's something akin to this maybe in what we deal with. There's an importance in staying calm during such situations. But it also depends on the brain you're bringing into these near-death experiences. Now, we're assuming that people have a lot of the 1A available so that when serotonin increases, it's going to hit a lot of 1A and we're going to remain calm. But what if you're in a state of heightened stress? What if you have depression? What if you have anxiety? What if you have PTSD? These are conditions in which it's the opposite on the amygdala. There's too much of the excitatory subtypes, not as much of the inhibitory ones. So whenever serotonin increases, it's going to hit what's there. This is one of the reasons when you start an SSRI, people can get worse because they have too much of the excitatory receptors there. All you're doing is blocking reuptake. So it's going to bind to what's present. So you get a little bit worse. So that can happen here as well. A serotonin surge happens, and people may actually have a very distressing near-death experience. So about 11 to 22% of cases are actually very unpleasant for people. And the proposed subtypes are these, and none of these sound good. So inverse is very similar feature-wise in terms of the progression, but it's very unpleasant and it's scary. Hellish is hellish. You go to hell, basically, and you see suffering and you see weird animals, and you can have a life review that's very judgmental. And the void is one where nothing you've done matters, nothing you've done is real, and nothing you've done has any meaning. It's been argued that third subtype is the type that needs the most psychological support. And if people have, in suicide, people who attempt suicide, about a quarter may experience a near-death type event. So if a distressing near-death experience happens, it's more likely to happen in the context of a suicide attempt. Some people who attempt suicide do have the peaceful ones as well, but interestingly, whether they have an unpleasant one or a pleasant one, subsequent suicidality decreases. There have actually been people, who have tried to incorporate some knowledge they extract from near-death experiencers to decrease suicidality in patients, saying, this is what people have said after trying, there's a greater purpose, they're part of a greater fabric, and this might have therapeutic value. So in terms of the life review, we mentioned the inhibitory serotonin type receptor. The main excitatory one is 2A, and that's present in high-level association areas. And it's also present in the hippocampus, and it's present in visual areas. So, when external input is dampened, like in hypoxia and things like that, the person might be much more likely to draw from internal stores, internal bits of information, imagery, to sort of maintain some coherence as the brain is struggling to keep itself alive. So all these different areas of the brain get stimulated with that serotonin surge. The hippocampus is the area that's involved with encoding episodic memory. So that will help with some of the life review. The hippocampus has a high density of norepinephrine receptors, so very vivid memory recall. And the use of epinephrine in cardiac arrest might actually increase the frequency of near-death experiences in people surviving. So the way that people describe it subjectively, we mentioned before, people can have an immediate understanding of everything. The brain's operating in a very different, more accelerated manner. Some people say they see all of their life flash before their eyes, every single episode. Others say just the highlights. It's often presented by some figure asking, what did you do with your time here? But it doesn't tend to be in a judgmental way. It's a very forgiving figure more often than not. It's just more in the service of understanding. But they're often told, they're showed this at a boundary point, and they're said, you have to go back to fulfill your purpose and to keep living. And one interesting thing that can happen is, people will start to consider other people's perspectives a bit more. They may feel more empathy towards others. That's one of the longer-term effects of going through near-death experiences. There's some theory about the default mode network, which is it gives us our sense of ego. That gets broken up. And so we're much more able to sort of understand other people's points of view. In the life review, you may actually see all your episodes through somebody else's eyes. Bruce Grayson, he gives an example of this person who had a near-death experience, and he had beaten somebody up after sort of an argument in traffic or something like that. But when he went through the life review, he saw it through the other person's perspective. So he actually saw his own fists coming at his face, and he also learned from this person's internal experience how bereaved he was over having lost his wife. So interestingly, a not insignificant percentage of people may change their occupations after near-death experiences, and this tends to be people who are in lines of work that may involve, violence towards others and such, because they just can't do it anymore. They understand other people's perspectives too well, and they're unable to cause harm. We mentioned time distortion as well, and perception of time and the distortion of time is dopaminergic, largely. So a surge in dopamine can distort things. Things can feel slowed down. They can feel sped up. And one of the things that Albert Heim mentioned a lot in his accounts was timelessness, that everything just felt collapsed. Everything that I experienced in lifetime would be years and years and years. For me, it was like 10 seconds or something, everything that I was able to review. Those of you who watched and understood Interstellar, good for you. Maybe you can explain it to me. I feel this is somehow relevant to that. Albert Heim is a geology professor at ETH Zurich. And if you're able to pronounce what ETH stands for, good for you too. You probably understood Interstellar. So among his students was another Albert, Einstein. And in 1952, Einstein wrote a letter to an Arnold Heim, Albert's son, recounting the lectures as magical. So Green posited this idea, it takes little imagination to suggest that Heim may have described these near-death experiences to his students. As an object hurtles through space, time becomes relative depending on motion. This raises a fascinating question. Could Heim's accounts of NDEs have first suggested to Einstein that time and space were not fixed and constant, as physicists assume at the time, but were actually relative to each other? The idea, in short, that near-death experiences informed the theory of relativity. The incidence, or the prevalence rather, with which people encounter the dead during these near-death experiences varies from somewhere between 21 to 50%, depending on the accounts. It's much less likely to encounter somebody alive. And most of the time that you encounter somebody who's alive, they're telling you, please go back, kind of thing. There was one patient who was described who was kind of in and out, and the family was close by and such. And, when she had a moment of lucidity, she said, the reason that I keep coming back is because you keep praying for me. I need you to stop because I've seen what's beyond. I want to go there. Family stopped praying. She died. So in terms of encountering other people, there are a couple of theories of why this happens. So we mentioned before that the hippocampus is rich with 5-HT2A, which are excitatory, norepinephrine receptors, excitatory. So this activation of the hippocampus is going to cause memory retrieval. It makes sense, right? So we'll be drawing from memory stores of the living and the dead from our mind. The surge in dopamine might cause what's called source monitoring deficits. It's something we see in schizophrenia as well, that there's a difficulty in distinguishing what's coming from within from what's coming from without. This is proposed as a possible mechanism in hallucinations. It's coming from within, but I'm perceiving it externally. And this might be because of the dopamine surge. So these internally generated images might be externalized. And because of the stimulation of the occipital cortex, they might become very, very vivid and very real, as they say. Other visual phenomena that have been described is going through the tunnel, often a dark tunnel, and seeing the being of light. Now, there are those who have posited that, especially because when people go through the tunnel, they often describe it being very tight and squeezing through it, that it's a recapitulation of the birthing process in some ways, going through the tunnel into the light in a way. And, at least in Portuguese and Spanish, the word for giving birth is dar à luz, which means give to the light in a way. So the other people that are encountered during these experiences may serve as guides. They might give you the life review. And they may reach a border or a boundary, which can be a body of water, a door, a fence. In medieval descriptions, a bridge was very common. But the person is told some variation of this is not your time. This has been translated from many languages, from many cultures, and it's very consistent. It's some version of you have to go back. This is not your time. I will come find you later, and you will join us then. So one of the ultimate figures that's met is the being of light, which is described as indescribably brilliant, but you can see perfectly at the same time. They can communicate with you telepathically. And of those who meet some sort of divine or godlike being, about a third will say that they're consistent with their religious beliefs. And Moody and Perry said, whoever this being is, they radiate total love and understanding, so much so that most people want to be with it forever. So meeting this figure is associated with resistance to wanting to come back into one's body. So once you reach this point, a lot of people really do want to stay. And, sometimes they're given a choice, which is very weird to think about. They're like, you can stay here if you want, if you like it here so much, but your family is going to be worse off or your kids are going to be worse off. And so a lot of people end up choosing to come back into their body because they're worried about what's going to happen if they don't. And interestingly, I didn't mention this, the occipital lobe stimulation that we see and such, one study, only one that I was able to find, was done with individuals who were blind and had near-death experiences, and they described very similar features. They described light, even if they had never seen light. So there isn't a whole lot of literature in terms of long-term neurobiological findings. If one has an NDE, what happens to your brain in the long run? But there was one that assessed people who had encountered the being of light, and then that was their sort of meditative task. Think about that being of light. And then they looked at what happened in the brain. And one of the areas that lit up was the anterior insula, which is an area that's involved with ecstatic seizure auras, where people feel connected to a higher power or to God during a seizure episode. In a separate study, nothing to do with NDEs, Carmelite nuns, when they were in mystical states, feeling a union with God, they too had activation of the same area. So people will say, be careful when you say this is the God area of the brain. It's not quite that simple. But belief in God after a near-death experience. So, and this is where a distinction is important. Here, they had a life-threatening event, but they didn't have the near-death experience. And we're just going to look at the definitely such, because we're thinking in absolutes. So their belief in God, before a life-threatening experience and after, it goes up. There are no atheists in turbulence, they say, right? But if you actually have a near-death experience, the belief in God goes up significantly more. But beyond believing in God specifically, the importance of religious or spiritual life is similar. Life-threatening event goes up greatly. Okay. NDE, much, much more. But whatever it is that they're encountering, it helps people understand that there is a spiritual realm that they need to reckon with. But there's a paradoxical decrease in devotion to any particular religious tradition. It seems to be more of a general spirituality. And getting into something that is very complicated and that I don't particularly have a whole lot to say about, but it would come up during the Q&A otherwise. Non-local awareness. So this looks complicated, but it's not too bad. If we look at this graph here, feelings of connectedness, being awake, which hopefully everybody still is, and internally aware. Where we are right now, we are at our most connected, we're at our most awake, and we're at our most internally aware. This is normal conscious wakefulness. On the other end of the spectrum down here, not awake, not connected, and not internally aware, somebody's in a coma or anesthesia. Along the way, we have people who, having REM sleep, lucid dreaming, mindful meditation and such, psychedelics. Near-death experience is over here. Internal awareness is at its peak. So we're most internally aware, even though we're not awake, and we're not particularly connected to other people. So this is about as deep into our own minds as we're able to go while retaining awareness and being able to tell the tale. So what is it that we come in touch with? So there's something called the filter theory, or the bottleneck theory, or the single channel theory, that says that the brain is basically a gatekeeper. It keeps things out. It has a permissive function to it. So, if anybody's interested in quantum theory and near-death experiences, reference to Pim van Lommel is a Dutch cardiologist, and he goes into that in this book in a couple of chapters. It's pretty interesting, and there is a lot of conversation surrounding that. But the idea is consciousness in a way can create reality. So we're aware of a lot more than what meets the eye. And anytime we reduce something to a particular channel, we are collapsing a much more complicated reality. But when there's an organic insult and this filtration function is degraded, broader awareness happens. We can pick up on a lot more things. And this takes the form, this paper that came out by Parnia very recently, he talks about potential dormant pathways in the brain becoming activated in these degraded states. What they are is still a little bit conjectural. So a couple of weird things. There's something called the Picandarian phenomenon, and this comes from a poem, but there was a writer called Francis Cobb who sort of popularized the use of this term for encountering people during a near-death experience who are dead and you didn't know they were dead, kind of thing. So there are a lot of reports of this, people who, there was one report of this woman who had a near-death experience, and she comes out and she's like, I was at Heaven's Gate and people were going through. And I was told you can't go through because it's not your time to go. And then I came back and, she described who these people were, and it's like, they're not dead, but they were dead. And this has happened with family members, with families outraged. It's actually very sad. The family's like, we just talked to them. It could be a sibling, and then they find out that that person had actually died during the near-death experience of this other person. It's called Picandarian. This comes from the times of the conquistadors, Darien. This peak in Panama, where the Spaniards were climbing up the mountain, expecting to see a city on the other end of the peak, but they saw an ocean. So it's encountering something unexpected. But if you hear somebody talking about a Picandarian, they're probably talking about seeing somebody who's dead, and they didn't know they were dead. Near-death experiences in children have similar overall features, less of a life review. I mean, there's less to go through. There's more encounters with animals and pets, not as many encounters with the deceased, but they may encounter relatives they've never met. So this Picandarian is also relevant to kids. From this scale, item number 10 is extrasensory perception, ESP. So this can happen during out-of-body experiences. A 0 is no, that didn't happen. A 1 is yes, I perceived something, but it hasn't been corroborated. A 2 is yes, I perceived something and it turned out to be true. Like people floating about and noticing things. At the beginning of Bruce Grayson's book called After, very good book, he talks about this woman who was brought in by a friend after, I believe, an overdose. And the woman was unconscious, and Bruce went to talk to the friend who had brought her in. And, he was all kind of self-conscious about this spaghetti stain that he had on his tie. And then the next day when the patient woke up, she described seeing the conversation and noticing the stain on his tie. Janice Holden, she did a review of 107 reports or anecdotes of out-of-body experience perceptions during these NDEs. And she showed that for material perceptions, like things that are in the resuscitation room, things like that, only one of the reports was completely wrong. So for the most part, quite faithful accounts. For transmaterial perceptions, things like encountering people who turned out to be dead later, items that are lost, which have nothing to do with the resuscitation, only one was completely wrong. So they tend to be pretty high accuracy. People have tried to replicate this, scientists. Now, what they would do, they would kind of put these targets in rooms or areas, hospital settings that were more likely for something like this to happen. ICUs, ERs, coronary care units. They would put laptops high up on a shelf or something with a changing target. And, the idea was the person will have an out-of-body experience, they'll notice it, they'll come back, and they'll be able to tell me what they saw. So there were 6 studies, and that included 12 near-death experiences plus the out-of-body experience. Out of the 12, how many reported seeing that target that they had placed in the room? All of them? Yeah, none of them? Maybe some of them? Yeah, so none of them. Got it right. So Grayson tried to do something similar, but he didn't have success with anybody even having an out-of-body experience. But then he was telling people about these research attempts. And he said, when I discussed these research findings at a conference attended by a large number of people who had had near-death experiences, they were astounded at what they considered my naivete in carrying out the study. Why, they argued, would patients whose hearts had just stopped and who were being resuscitated, patients who were stunned by their unexpected separation from their bodies, go looking around the hospital room for a hidden image that has no relevance to them, but that some researcher had designated as the target? Fair point. I'm going to probably go right up to 1. Okay. Yeah. So people who have had near-death experiences can also have incorrect prophecies. There have been some very disturbing things that I won't get into that people have said they saw and have tried to perpetuate based on their own experiences. But people have predicted the end of the world. We're still here. That's from There Will Be Blood. So if you get the reference, good for you. He calls himself a false prophet at some point. Which leads us with coming back. So this was one account. The patient said, after I came back, I cried off and on for about a week because I had to live in this world after seeing that one. I didn't want to come back. So, they've come in touch with something very different, much more peaceful. Now, if you watch the end of Titanic, and if you don't want to know how Titanic ends, and I don't necessarily mean the ship going down, like the very, very end, when Rose is lying lying down in her bed, and she dies, basically. And she goes through this same sequence. There's a life review. They show her pictures. Her body kind of detaches. She goes through a tunnel, which is the deck. She reaches a boundary, which is that door, but they open it for her because she actually is dying. She's surrounded by the dead, and they're surrounded by light as well. She reunites with Jack, but then the camera looks up into the light, which would be seeing the being of light. So it follows the same sequence. And it's said that that is what people go through when they actually die. Now, you imagine if we're going up into the light and the next scene is clear, and she's kind of coming out of it, and, she's surrounded by all these things, and we're taken from that space. That's what it can feel like for some people. It can be very difficult based on what they've seen. So in terms of long-term effects, there's a lot of variation in the literature. So some people suggest that changes can last for decades after these experiences. People are more spiritual. They change their life priorities. And other people say, not so much. Real life kind of takes over, and there isn't a whole lot that changes. But the vividness and the hyperreality lends itself to very, very consistent reports. Like Grayson looked at people after 2 decades, and the scores that they had on the scale and their descriptions were very faithful, and they were very similar. So people don't tend to embellish it. It's not the type of thing that you toy with. But Moody said our contemporary society is just not the sort of environment in which reports of this nature would be received with sympathy and understanding. Many have remarked that they realized from the very beginning that others would think they were mentally unstable if they were to relate their experiences. So patients can be very reluctant to share what happened. This is a bit of a non sequitur, but there was a study that was done with Franciscan nuns in meditative prayer, and they showed some changes in a couple of areas, in the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, and such. Just what happens in their brain when they're meditating, basically, when they're praying. And Grayson was talking about this research, and he said when the scientist Newberg showed these brain scans to his fellow neuroscientists, their response was purely physical. So those are the parts of the brain that make them think they're talking to God. When he showed the same brain scans to the nuns, their response combined physical and non-physical. So those are the parts of the brain God uses to talk to me. It's a very different outlook. And from a sociocultural perspective, cultures that report greater numbers of near-death experiences have funerary practices that actually facilitated the deceased returning to life. Longer wake periods, there's a whole literature on Orpheus myths being brought into funerary practices where, the spouse of the deceased will create a little grave next to them and hope that they'll kind of come back. In the Orpheus myth, that there is an ascension from the underworld. And they have more positive attitudes towards the dead and a greater interest in an afterlife. These cultures tend to have more afterlife myths and that they incorporate. So they welcome people who have had these experiences and can tell them what they've seen. Cultures that have a scarcity of near-death experiences tend to bury their dead very quickly. Anybody who's read the Edgar Allan Poe tale, The Premature Burial, it's terrifying because it feels like it could happen to anybody. So there's some societies that will bury the body when it's still warm because they don't want the dead coming back. And they may have less of an interest in these afterlife speculations. The dead were not to be trusted, and therefore neither was the testimony of somebody who had a near-death experience, whose very identity was open to question due to possession fears. Gregory Shushan, reference number 1 there. He's the big investigator. Interpersonal level, marriages in which one partner had a near-death experience are less well-adjusted and less stable than before the near-death experience. The divorce rate is higher. This instability is usually attributed to problems communicating about a couple's challenges, disagreements on roles, and dissimilar values and goals. There's no one I can talk to about this. My wife doesn't want to hear about it. She doesn't want to hear anything at all about my experience. She says she married a gentle, hardworking, funny guy, not an Old Testament prophet. You have 2 minutes? Okay. So I resisted the temptation of calling this DIY NDE. And yet I said it anyway. So salvia, ketamine can give you similar experience to near-death experiences. There's one case report of somebody who got 7 milligrams per kilo of ketamine and had a near-death type experience. So the only drug I was going to mention quickly is DMT, which is also called the God molecule, the spirit molecule, the businessman's lunch trip. You can smoke it and it'll be over in 20 minutes. So DMT is present in human urine, blood, CSF. There's a sense that it can be released during the near-death state because it's an antioxidant. So the brain's trying to protect itself in a way. It's been found in the pineal gland, the third eye chakra, at least in rodents, although even if they don't have the pineal, it's still there. So the brain in a very vulnerable state may be super sensitive to even small amounts of DMT, but this is still somewhat conjectural. And there are types of meditation. There's something called the fire kasina meditation. This is pre-Buddhist, so this goes way, way, way back. Look at a flame, and once it's in your head, close your eyes and meditate on the image of that flame. Once it goes away, open your eyes, do it again, keep doing it. Do it for 6.5 to 11 hours a day for 17 to 22 days, and you can have a near-death type experience. So the predominant lessons that people bring back, and these are the last 2 slides, from these near-death experiences, they're very simple. Be kind to other people and continue to learn. So many religious traditions have their own versions of the golden rule. Treat others the way you wish to be treated. That figure of light is very forgiving, and it shows us that the way of forgiveness is very possible, seeing people more than just as the sum of their flaws. Those who have transgressed, they can emerge from near-death experiences with a different purpose and approach towards life. So the figure views our mistakes as stepping stones on the path to learning, and how much more tolerant would our world be if we extended the same grace to other people. And that perhaps is the real attraction of the near-death experience. It shows us what's possible not in the next world, but in this one. Thank you.
Very, very much, Chris. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I bring it over. I have just more of a comment. Could you maybe explain to everyone who Bruce Greyson is and the Institute at UVA, and I think that might help.
So he's at UVA. I want to say it's the Department of Perceptual Studies, Paranormal Studies, Division of Perceptual Studies over there. So he was kind of a contemporary with Raymond Moody back in the day. So he's kind of the eminent figure in near-death experiences from a neuroscience standpoint, from a phenomenological standpoint. His scale is kind of the scale. Yeah.
He's a psychiatrist.
He's a psychiatrist, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. This is the most fascinating talk I've ever heard. I'm from anesthesiology. But my question is, how would you reconcile this kind of biological explanation of this, storm of neurotransmitters and mediators that can explain this kind of altered reality or hyper, perception, but with things like extrasensory perception that this subject may not even know or things like that. So can it be explained by that same biological mechanisms?
Um, no, I have not found anything from a neuroscience standpoint. So I situated in sort of the non-local awareness kind of category. There's nothing that, like, from a neuroscience standpoint that can really account for that. The only explanations I've seen or theorizing is from quantum physics, really. Kind of, that we have sort of some sort of um, quantum entanglement with other kind of realms of space and time, and that somehow we're picking up on those types of things. And, in a state of diminished conscious awareness, that the brain is just able to kind of take in more information than we can necessarily see and be consciously aware of otherwise. But, even that's quite disputed. So I think it's an interesting area for future study, because I haven't seen, a clear, consistent, agreed upon explanation for how that can happen.
We have one from the chat, which I can read to you.
Yeah, sure.
If I can have something to say if you don't. Would late-stage Alzheimer's patients, those for whom Alzheimer's is the cause of death, theoretically be capable of having these experiences? Would the mechanisms be too involved, or would the mechanisms involved be too severely impaired? What about other dementia types?
I think these types of experiences have been reported in a whole slew, I think, of patients. I haven't encountered anything that would suggest otherwise. I think, at least from the cholinergic model of Alzheimer's disease, that would be the most.
And no, I think actually, this I have it interesting. Yes, they are reported in people. There's this idea of like terminal lucidity often in people with Alzheimer's, and I think it kind of touches on what Chris talked about, of the idea of that gatekeeper, like maybe something is holding up everything, holding our whole world out, the reality around us, and then as that breaks down, you're still able to have those.
Yeah, and at least in the phenomenology, pathophysiology of Parkinson's psychosis, for instance, there's something that is a little bit akin in a way, because you also have serotonergic degradation in Parkinson's, and there's a compensatory increase in 5-HT2A receptor along the visual cortex pathways and such. So that's where some of the visual hallucinations can come from. And you may also have a similar sort of source monitoring problem. So if anything, I think, in states of brain compromise, we might actually be a little bit more predisposed.
Good argument for non-locality of consciousness, because you have the brain is this broken vessel of something that exists outside of it.
But it's over. You can't, sir. You enjoyed it? Did it change your beliefs? What? Did it change your beliefs? Oh, thanks.